A lot of political change has happened without widespread war. I'm thinking, for example, of the breakup of the Soviet Union. There was constant fear that the Cold War might heat up, but in the end, the Soviet Union disintegrated more or less peacefully. The same could be said of the arrival of a degree of capitalism in China. It's also worth remembering that although being in a war zone is of course very harmful to the smooth functioning of an economy, the damage can also be repaired. I mean, think of the recovery of Europe's economies after the devastation of World War II. Will a trade war cripple the global economy? Well, economic historians teach there was a previous age of globalization. It happened from the end of the 19th century up until about World War I. But that age of globalization ended in a series of world wars, political reactions against trade, and Great Depression. Could that all happen again? The world does have now more than 50 years of momentum toward more free trade since the end of World War II. And despite the fact that every trade agreement is a major political battle, this general momentum toward free trade seems to me extremely difficult to stop. After all, the costs of trade keep falling. Communications keeps getting easier. Management of global businesses, the legal and financial issues, the transportation issues for going across international borders are all getting somewhat easier over time. And the economic gains from taking advantage of trade are only going to continue. So I sort of expect that process to be ongoing. Will an energy shortage stop long-run growth? Well, over the next 30 to 40 years, prices of current energy sources like oil and natural gas may well rise. But there's little reason, looking at the projections that are out there, to expect an outright shortfall where there just won't be energy available. I'd say that beyond that 40-year window, it gets a lot harder to say for a variety of reasons. At the very long term, the hope is that emerging technology may uncover new energy sources to exploit, or more efficient ways to make use of resources, or substitutes for energy in one way or another. It's worth noting that a lot of the economic gains of recent years, like information and computer technology, are not heavily dependent on extremely heavy energy use. I mean, they require some electricity, but they're not like heavy industry in that way. So I don't think an energy crunch is going to derail the world economy, at least for a few decades. Will an environmental crisis stop long-run growth? Well, one way or another, we're going to need to pay for a clean environment. Either you pay because you're living in a dirty environment, or you pay to clean it up. The U.S. economy pays something like 2 to 3% of GDP on costs related to keeping the environment clean. And the good news is that this share of keeping the environment clean seems to be more or less constant. It's not increasing over time. So as the economy grows, we can continue to make things cleaner without committing ever more resources. The other good news is that rapidly growing economies like China and India and Mexico have become much more aware of the environment than the U.S. was, say, a century ago. And the quality of air and water in those countries, while it's not great by U.S. standards, is actually typically improving. In general, a richer world will be more willing to spend resources on environmental protection. In fact, if we were to tax energy sources for environmental purposes, like reducing the risk that greenhouse warming might occur, we would also increase incentives for conserving energy and reduce that earlier concern that we might run into a problem of energy running out. Will population growth outstrip world economic growth? In the 1960s and 1970s, you could read a lot about how rapid population growth was going to overwhelm economic growth very soon. The current thinking is quite a bit different. The current thinking focuses on the idea that countries go through a demographic transition, where birth rates come way, way down and health and life expectancy go way, way up. In Japan and countries across Europe, this demographic transition is so strong that populations are expected to actually start declining, and declining substantially in the next half century. Even in many low-income countries, like countries in Europe or in Africa and in South Asia, birth rates are way, way down from what they were in the 1960s and 1970s. As my wife likes to note, it's pretty amazing what happens when women get a little more education and contraception becomes widely available. The current projections are that world population may well top out around about 2050 and then actually be flat or declining after that. Sometimes it seems as if the global economy is nothing but a threat to the United States. But the future economy is going to have remarkable opportunities along with its challenges. Sometimes when you listen to politics in the United States, it's like everything is threatening. All trade is potentially threatening. It's threatening if it's trade with a high-wage country like Japan or Germany. It's threatening if it's low-wage trade with a low-wage country like China or India. International trade is certainly a force for disruption, but it's also a spur for economic growth. At the end of the day, I think here's one of the fundamental questions people need to ask. Would you prefer to live in a world where the U.S. economy grows at 3% per year and the rest of the world grows at an average of 5% per year? So the U.S. has 3% growth, but the rest of the world is catching up. Or would you rather live in a world where the U.S. economy averages 2% growth a year and the rest of the world averages 1% a year? Do you prefer a faster absolute rate of growth for the U.S. economy? Or do you prefer the U.S. staying ahead of the other countries of the world and the other countries not being able to catch up? To a large extent, a lot of issues of globalization are questions about whether the U.S. is going to grow along with the rest of the world or whether the rest of the world is going to be somehow held back while the U.S. tries to maintain a certain edge. Most economists prefer a higher absolute rate of growth and recognize the rest of the world may grow more quickly, and we view that as a good thing too. Ultimately, each nation has control over its own economic growth, as determined by its own policies. No one is forced by globalization to enact bad policies. For example, nations can decide whether or not they're going to encourage long-term savings and investment in a market-oriented context, and how they're going to increase productivity. Other nations, when they grow, are not growing at the expense of the United States. The United States is not growing at the expense of other nations. The world economy is not a zero-sum game with a fixed amount of growth. Instead, it's a cooperative venture where we can all grow more quickly if we work together in networks of trade and production and technology and knowledge going all around the world. Each nation within this network remains responsible for its own destiny. If nations undertake policies that build human capital, that help build physical capital, that create new technology, and that lead to a better legal and financial infrastructure for supporting markets, then those nations are going to tend to grow. Nations which can't put together that package of ingredients are not going to grow. Now, there are certainly reasons to be concerned over the future competitive position of the U.S. economy. For example, with human capital, there are big issues about how can we improve K through 12 education so U.S. workers of the future will have a really solid level of basic education. There are questions about whether the U.S. is educating enough scientists and engineers to really deal with the new technologies of the future. There are macroeconomic questions about the level of savings and the level of investment that occur. How will the United States, for example, address the extremely large budget deficits that it's projected to have several decades into the future? How is this country going to deal with the aging of its population and the large projected rise in Social Security and especially Medicare spending? And when we think about new technology, really one of the main drivers of economic growth, is the U.S. spending enough on research and development? With intellectual property rights, are we providing the right kind of incentives for future growth? These are all real problems, but they're also problems that the U.S. is going to need to face by itself. In that way, our future is really in our own hands.